It was Christmas Eve in the future. Everywhere the snow was falling. Down the stairs, out of sixth-floor windows, off ledges, and over things lying on the pavement. Crash, bang, bang, cronk, kaplat, it went. "Snow's jolly heavy today," said Sarah. "And big. Some of those flakes are 15 feet across. Or even in the present. I wonder," but no one would ever know what it was she wondered, because sadly a snowflake landed on her, and she ceased wondering about it, or about anything else ever again. "Don't grumble, dear," murmured her mother, hurrying to get away from the snow. But it was too late. 3 huge flakes screamed down out of the air on her with incredible ferocity. Her last thought before they hit her was, "I must make Dennis his sandwiches." Who Dennis was, we shall never know, but he certainly wasn't her husband, whose name was Frank. And what of Frank? Well, at that very moment, Frank, unaware of the flaky demise of his wife and daughter, was gazing out of the kitchen window. He was a big fan of the future, but not so much of the new snow. "Terrible snow," he said. "Yes," agreed his companion. "It's black and hard as rocks." "Not really like snow, is it?" "Perhaps it's coal," suggested Frank. "Ha!" snorted his companion, who had no name at all because of some really aggravating mix-up with the Registrar of Births, Marriages and Deaths, which still hasn't been sorted out despite dozens and dozens of letters he had sent, none of which were ever replied to because they appeared to have come from no one at all. All of this made him an extremely tetchy companion, given to violent outbursts on the subjects of snow, nuclear power, and for some strange reason, to do with his mysterious parents, cami knickers. "That's absolutely bloody nonsense. When did you last see any cami knickers anywhere, let alone falling out of the sky?" "Don't you mean, when did I last see coal?" asked Frank quietly. "Of course I meant coal," yelled the one whose name may not be mentioned because he hasn't got one. "Well, if you mean coal, then the last time I saw coal was many, many years ago." "Exactly," expostulated the nameless one triumphantly, and then had to sit down and rest again, because expostulating triumphantly is much more complicated and tiring than simply saying something. Try it and see. "And you know why? I'll tell you why. It's because of all the cami knicker stations." At this point, Frank grew weary of the conversation, because it was nonsense, and went down to his job in the vault. "I meant power stations!" shouted his companion down the steps after him. "I meant nuclear power stations! You know perfectly well I meant the nuclear power stations! You know that when I say cami knickers, I really mean cami knickers. I mean, oh blast it, I hate the future!" But the great steel door to the vault swung closed after Frank, and what the man without a name said was never heard, except by a small chaffinch who spoke only Mandarin Chinese and was therefore unable to attach any meaning to his words. So the nameless one gave up, and glumly sat in a chair and stroked his large tumour, which he liked to call Percy. The reason Frank had a job in a vault was that if you had a job, it was best to have a vault to keep it in. Jobs were like gold dust. Better, in fact. If you had gold dust, you had to keep on hoovering it up and then remembering not to throw it out with the rubbish. But if you had a job, that was really something. Keep it in a vault. That was the best thing. Frank had a job with one of the most successful and profitable corporations in the world. It did have a name, but it had been changed an awful lot of times. This morning, it was called Happiness, Truth and Health Incorporated, and it was the public relations company which many years ago had been given the contract to do a campaign to tell people that nuclear power was perfectly safe, really. What a big contract that was. Boy, with every new nuclear accident that happened, the contract just got bigger and bigger. The company's stock went through the roof so regularly now, they'd given up having it repaired and just put a pink umbrella over the stock exchange. Last year, it had completely bought out the other giant public relations company, the United Sony Coca-Cola World Bank of Texaco Comics Corporation, Armaments, Drugs and Origami Division, previously known as the United States of America. So that had been a terrific step forward. Most of the company's employees were now so rich that they could afford to have radiation-proof vaults to keep their jobs in. Frank rubbed his hands together and eagerly got to work. Today's job was just the sort of one he liked the most. Wordcraft, he called it. Wordcraft. Last week, they launched a massive campaign to tell people the huge new nuclear power station that had been built where the Lake District used to be was the safest one ever. This week, it had completely blown up, and that called for Wordcraft. A little song, maybe, a jingle. He got stuck for a while whilst trying to find a rhyme for collateral damage, and sucked his pencil. Acceptable tolerances had a nice ring to it, but it was rhythmically awkward. No, he had to stress the safety angle. How safe the whole thing was, even in spite of the fact it had quite clearly exploded. This had been a big accident. A slight thrill went through him. Maybe now was the time. Maybe it had come at last. The big one. Maybe the world was ready. The one he had been saving. The one that said it all. The big one. His baby. Feverishly, he fished in the desk drawer for the key to the little lacquer box he'd kept pride of place on his desk. He found it, and fumbling with excitement, he opened the box. There lay the piece of paper neatly folded. He picked it out with trembling fingers, unfolded it, and smoothed it out on the desktop. He read the few words on it through to himself. He let his breath out slowly. They were as fine as he remembered them being. Big, bold, irrefutable. Magic. And now at last there had been an accident big enough to be worthy of them. He reached for the phone. A few minutes later, he emerged from the vault and found his erstwhile companion slumped in a chair, dead. At least that solved the name problem. They could now call him Percy. He smiled happily to himself and stepped outside. Christmas was in the air, along with a number of other noxious substances. It had stopped snowing now, but the street would probably need some repairs after this afternoon's fall. He threw his hat in the air with pleasure and excitement. I hadn't mentioned that he was wearing a hat, but he was, and this was the hat he now threw into the air. The reason I hadn't mentioned the hat before was that throwing it in the air is the first interesting thing he had done with it, and I was waiting for that. Dinner that evening was a little odd. Frank had a vague sense that there was something missing. The smart TV sensed his unease, guessed that he would probably like to see something a bit festive, and turned itself on. Frank got himself a can of something fizzy, and sat and watched himself having a terrific time on the Two Complete Assholes Christmas special. It was great. He hadn't actually been there when it was recorded the previous August, of course, but this smart TV knew what Frank looked like and had no trouble mapping him into the picture so he could see what a really wonderful time he was having this Christmas. He relaxed. After the show came the news. He looked round to tell his wife to watch, at which point he suddenly realised what it was that was missing. His wife, Sarah. Oh well, he thought, that's what you get for having a nuclear family. He settled back and watched the reports on the nuclear power station explosion. It had been really huge and was going to make it very difficult to get into Scotland for the foreseeable future, which was a pity, not with Hogmanay coming up. But the minister explained that because the number of people who had been collaterally damaged and the number of jobs that were going to be created by the exciting new project to build a huge tunnel into Scotland, the unemployment figures, seen as a percentage, was going to drop significantly. It's an ill wind, he joked pleasantly. The interviewer agreed that it almost certainly was an extreme ill wind indeed, and turned to the question of safety. The old question, said the minister with a smile. I don't know why people keep on about it. I must have said it 1,000,000 times if I've said it once. It's perfectly safe. And you say that despite this terrible accident? Asked the interviewer in astonishment. I say that because this not quite so terrible as you make out accident, smiled the minister reassuringly. I say the fact that we can have an accident like this proves that it's safe. The interviewer's face dropped. He stuttered, and the minister winked. Frank knew that he was winking at him personally, because that was the line he had thought up. He beamed with pride because he knew that there was no answer to that. Outside, a chaffinch sang to say that the story was over.